Pleasure to be here today. We have a great day lined up. My name is Sarah Labowitz, and until about 5 o'clock today, I'm a policy advisor in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department. And I'll say more on that in a second. But my job today is a good one. It's fun. It's to make sure that you have the information you need to get the most out of the great program that the folks in e-diplomacy have lined up and to keep things running smoothly. So in that vein, let me give you a quick overview of what to expect today. In the morning, we're going to get an overview of the key issues from really some of the most prominent experts in the world. We're going to have welcoming remarks from Dean Greg Maggs, Assistant Secretary Mike Posner. We're going to have a keynote from McLaughlin. Dan Nunziato is going to chair a plenary panel. Then we'll move into some Ignite sessions. We'll do some Twitter polls. We'll have lunch. And then in the afternoon, we'll get a little bit more interactive. We'll have some breakout sessions. Then we'll come back together. We'll have a closing from Danny Weitzner. And then we get to go upstairs and have a reception and have a drink. So, today is my last day at the State Department after about 3.5 years. And I started in the fall of 2009. Our community was really very small, both inside and outside of government. And at that time, and throughout the time that I was running the Internet Freedom Program in DRL, I was incredibly lucky to be the beneficiary of the advice and guidance and friendship of many of the people here in the room and who are following us online. So this 10th Tech at State is really a signal of the arrival of Internet freedom and the maturity of this community. We've got embassies watching on the live stream, people all over the world following on the hashtag, which is Tech at State, spelled out, and a great group here in the room. So none of this is possible, of course, without institutional support. Thank you to GW Law School and its Global Internet Freedom and Human Rights and Distinguished Speaker Series and its sponsor, which is Microsoft. Thank you also to MetroStar Systems, which is the creator of Zoomph, the tweet moderation tool we're using today. And of course, thank you to the team at e-diplomacy at State, which has put together the great program that we have today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dean Gregory Maggs, who is the acting dean of GW Law School. He's been a faculty member at GW Law since 1993 and the interim dean for the last 2 months, I understand. So he teaches mainly in the areas of commercial law, constitutional law, contracts, and counterterrorism law, written extensively on these subjects. So with that, Dean Maggs.
Sarah, thank you very much. Let me give you a warm welcome on behalf of the entire law school faculty and staff. We're delighted that you can all be here. As Sarah mentioned, this event is co-sponsored by GW Law's Global Internet Freedom Project and Tech at State. We're grateful for the generous financial support of Microsoft and also for the great folks at Tech at State, particularly Tim Hayes and Isaiah Jew, who've worked very hard together with our own Professor Don Nunziato and Arturo Carrillo. Professor Nunziato is an expert in the area of free speech and internet and the author of Virtual Freedom, Net Neutrality, and Free Speech in the Internet Age, a book I highly recommend. And also Professor Arturo Carrillo, who is an expert in public international law, transitional justice, human rights, and I understand today's panels will address how to research, detect, and monitor internet repression, what tools have been employed to limit freedom on the internet, what technologies are available to counter and circumvent these tools. These are all very, very important topics which affect many people around the globe. I wish you a really successful and productive conference as we discuss these matters. And so let's let the conference begin. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dean Maggs. So now it's my pleasure to introduce my boss, Mike Posner, who until about 5 o'clock today is the Assistant Secretary for democracy, human rights, and labor. So it is also Mike's last day at the State Department. He's been the Assistant Secretary since 2009. Before that, had a distinguished career as a pioneer in the human rights field. And I'm delighted to be going with him to NYU, where we're going to open a center on business and human rights starting on Monday. So, Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is, I think, my last public event, so it's a particularly appropriate one for me. I'm really very proud of the work we've done and all you've done on internet freedom, and it's great to be hosting this event. Our work has spanned my entire time at the State Department, and I want to take a minute today to take stock of where we've come from, where we are today, and then try to identify a few of the challenges we face going forward. When I started in this job in 2009, internet freedom was not generally considered a foreign policy issue, but we've come a long way. We've seen speeches articulating our policies, 3 by Secretary of State Clinton. We've seen strong support from Congress, over $100 million now for internet programs, freedom programs over the last several years. And we've seen a variety of international organizations take up internet freedom, most notably the UN Human Rights Council, where in 2012 they adopted a historic resolution by consensus, amazingly, affirming that people around the world have the same rights online as they do offline. We've partnered with 18 other governments through the Freedom Online Coalition, the first ever group of like-minded countries committed to working together to carry this agenda forward of a free and open internet. Today, internet freedom is part of our daily work at the State Department, and the internet freedom community, many of you in this room, has grown substantially since I first started. It's really been inspiring to be part of this evolution and growth. Unfortunately, during the same period, many governments have become a lot more sophisticated about infiltrating, controlling the online space. They've sought new ways to impose new legal regimes, acquire new technologies to censor content, and to identify and persecute dissidents for what they do online. The power of this technology is now obvious to everyone. While more people around the world are getting online every day, there are also more internet users each day whose access is tracked or controlled, who feel they can't express themselves, or who face arrest or worse for using the internet to tell their stories or to organize. The overall picture is really quite complex, but in many places, the internet space is actually contracting rather than becoming a better way for multi-stakeholder institutions to engage more participants in governance and deliver the benefits of the internet and other connecting technologies to more in the world. We need to move past old debates. We need to capitalize on what we've achieved, but we need to figure out how to advance the broad consensus that human rights apply online just as they do offline. The fact that that's now been articulated in a UN form is a huge success, and it reaffirms this consensus. But we need to go further towards realizing this vision of the internet where all people can benefit from these new technologies. A big part of this is getting more people in the world online. But it also means promoting local content so people can find the information that most affects their lives in their own languages. It means promoting awareness of the social and economic benefits of being connected. And it means spreading better awareness of how to stay safe online. Our positive vision should also aim at making participating in the governance process less difficult. Many groups struggle with the volume and variety of meetings, processes,
and that includes governments as well as civil society. We need to make it easier for all stakeholders, especially those in the developing world, to take a meaningful role and to participate. Of course, some of the institutions themselves need to be more inclusive and transparent. Some governments simply are never going to embrace these changes, but we need to do more to build the capacity of our partners in the world and give them a greater chance to make this vision real. I was with several colleagues in Nairobi last September where the Kenyans held a meeting to address these issues, and it was really striking how many people of goodwill in the African continent, both governments and non-governmental actors and some companies, were completely shut out of or unaware even of the discussion we're having here today. So we've got a lot of work to do in that area. While we won't always be able to agree on everything, we should work together where we can. Governments that oppose our vision for an open internet, who want more control, state control of content online, are quite good at exploiting the differences between us. We should make it hard for them. Everyone in this room has a role to play in developing and promoting a positive vision for internet governance. The second area I want to focus on is how to make our policy smarter. This is a job that's never finished. One example where we've tried to change and adapt, but we still have a lot more work to do, is with respect to sanctions. We've tried simultaneously to keep bad technologies out of places like Iran and Syria, but to get good technologies in. And it's hard, and we don't always get there in hitting the right balance. We've created new sanctions to target those who use or using or sending surveillance and censorship technology into those countries, and we've tried to make it easier to get helpful technologies in through general license for free personal communications tools and through a favorable statement of licensing policies. But we have a lot more work to do in this area. These kinds of challenges where legitimate goals can come in conflict will come up across all kinds of policy areas, like developing better cybersecurity systems. Policies live up to the high standards we articulate abroad. That's a challenge, and consistency between domestic and foreign policy is something all governments struggle with, including our own, maybe especially our own, and it's something we take seriously. We appreciate your input. We need your input. We need you to hold our feet to the fire in helping us achieve such consistency. The third and final challenge that I just want to mention here briefly is one that many of you commit your days and nights to working on already. It's the hard work of supporting people on the ground who face internet repression. When I started in this job, few people understood what internet freedom programs looked like, and the field of implementers was very small. Now in this room, there's a sense that some of the brightest minds in this field who are developing business, and many of you are involved. Our understanding of the most pressing challenges for internet freedom are very different today than they were 4 years ago. The rise of targeted malware, increased use of mobile devices, engagement with policymakers in other countries to promote internet freedom policies all represent new and important dimensions of this activity. We need to keep working together to identify emerging needs and trends in the field and where the State Department and the U.S. government can help. This conference and tomorrow's unconference is an opportunity to explore new ideas and collaborations on programming. I'm excited to hear what you all think up, and I will be watching from my new perch. With that, I want to get out of the way and let you all get to work. I just want to say that, again, internet freedom has been an important issue for me over the last several years, and I hope to continue collaborating with all of you on these issues after Sarah and I move to the Stern School at NYU to begin working and building a center on business and human rights. Thank you all for what you do.
Great. A bit challenging to do this on one foot. All right, so thanks, Mike. And in a minute, we'll introduce Andrew McLaughlin, who's going to give our keynote address. But first, I want to give a shout out to some of the embassies who are watching on the live stream and following on Twitter. Embassy Istanbul, Baku, Harare in Zimbabwe, Hong Kong, embassies in Ghana. So really a great following from around the world. And it's exciting to see so many of our embassies actively engaged on this issue. Betaworks acquired last year. He's on the board of several organizations which are near and dear to those of us in this room, Access Now, Code for America, the Sunlight Foundation, and Public Knowledge. He previously worked at Tumblr, Google, and ICANN, and from 2009 to 2011 was Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States. Andrew.
Thank you very much. First off, is there a clicker that I should be using? Here it is. All right, great. So first of all, let's give it up for Michael Posner and Sarah Labowitz. I can't believe we're here on your last day. It's fantastic. So I first got to know Michael Posner when I was at Google and he was at Human Rights First, and we were trying to bridge the gap between for-profit companies and the advocacy world. I next got to work with him on the vastly more difficult project when I was at the White House and he was at the State Department of getting those two institutions to work together. It reminded me of that old, probably apocryphal story of Speaker Rayburn, who one day has a freshman, Democrat member of the House walking alongside him in the hallways, and the new freshman Democrat says something kind of nasty about the Republicans, and Speaker Rayburn says, "Let me tell you one very important thing. The Republicans are our opponents. The Senate is the enemy." And so that project now comes to a conclusion today. Thank you very much. You two have done yeoman's work and remarkable work in this area. All right, so what I want to talk about today is trying to move beyond what probably to most of the people in this room is the relatively familiar confines of the Internet freedom debate, such as it is. And so I'm going to try to drill down on two kind of complicating wrinkles that are worth focusing on at this point in the evolution of the issue, which is non-state actors and organizations and their role, and also the second one, which I'm going to get to in just a second. I'm having a momentary brain freeze. Let's get into the presentation. So this is the obligatory slide that I always have to start off with, which is, yes, the revolutions in Egypt took place in early 2011. The Internet was around. People used it. Yes, the revolutions in 1989 in Eastern Europe took place. The Internet was not around. And so I'm not saying anything here which is aggrandizing or saying that the Internet is some magical force that creates social revolutions. Rather, it is, like the role of the microwave in cooking, a new thing that is worth studying because it changes the dynamics. So having said that, let's take a look at three close case studies that will surface the issues that I want to talk about. The first one is Egypt in 2011. So what was interesting about Egypt in 2011, in part, was the fact that the country was situated at the heart of quite a bit of connectivity. Up until 2011, all of the fiber cables that went through Egypt, and if you look on this chart here, you can see it's a little bit hard to see, but a lot of the Europe to Asia connectivity lands in the Red Sea, goes overland past Cairo to Alexandria, and then continues underwater to Europe. And so Egypt literally physically housed a very significant percentage of the bandwidth that connects up major continents of the world. And in fact, this building, 26 Ramsey Street in Cairo, was the exchange point that much of the east-west internet connectivity flowed through, at least the spurs that connected those cables to Egypt. And so when the shutdown happened, which I'm sure everybody here knows about, it was quite dramatic, it was quite sudden. You can see the 5 telecom major internet providers here, the telecom. When Libya shut down its internet early in 2011, when the post-Iranian election unrest was taking place and the Iranian government shut down access to YouTube, the physical infrastructure of the internet actually matters and gives governments that understand how to concentrate and control it a lever that they can use to restrict their citizens' ability to communicate with each other. One interesting footnote, by the way, to the Egyptian revolution was that after the Egyptians were out on the streets and after the government Mubarak regime fell, the political force that emerged to take advantage of that vacuum was one that long predated the existence of the internet and was structured in ways that were essentially totally independent of internet connections. In other words, the internet's tools enabled people to get onto the street with an efficiency that maybe in some respect is unprecedented, and yet when the power vacuum was there to be filled, the Muslim Brotherhood was the organization that came in to fill it with pre-existing human and social structures that were vastly more resilient and capable of action than anything the internet could produce. All right, so let's move to case study number 2, which is the emergence of incredibly sophisticated forms of malware. And here, the point that I want to draw out is that when the Stuxnet virus came and hit the nuclear enrichment facility in Natanz, it was of such an astonishing level of sophistication and complexity that most observers have concluded that it could only have come from a state actor. That is something that we will probably never know, or if we do know, it'll probably be quite a long time from now. But regardless, it was of such complexity, and its operation required such specific knowledge about the SCADA systems and other operating systems for the equipment that it affected, that it's hard to imagine how anything other than a very large research team could have put it together. Now, at the same time that we see examples of state actors engaging in sort of malware-type attacks on physical infrastructure, we also see these networks of non-state actors like Anonymous taking action in often socially motivated ways. In other words, organizing hacks and DDoS attacks to make political points. And the collective known as Anonymous has maybe become the most prominent example of that. So to me, what's really interesting, though, are the groups that now are emerging and that we're seeing in action that live between the state actors and the non-state actors, the loosely organized internet-type groups that come together. One that I've been watching recently has been the Syrian Electronic Army. Oops, now I need to go back. There we go. In Syria right now, if you're an activist, you are in a very precarious position. And if you're using a mobile phone or a computer. And that's because there is a group of people, we assume that they're affiliated with the Assad regime, that are engaged in quite sophisticated forms of attack. They are quite brazen about what they do. Here you can actually see the Electronic Syrian Army's website. They've got a Facebook homepage that periodically gets taken down. And here's what they do. These are, by the way, screenshots grabbed by EFF, which has been doing great work to uncover this, group's work. What in fact it does when you open this file up, though, is place a set of executable programs into your Windows machine and runs a background process that you probably won't even notice and deposits on your machine something called the Dark Comet Remote Access Tool, which does things, really astonishing things like captures a full webcam feed even if you haven't turned it on, records keystrokes, steals passwords, disables antivirus software. Again, a widely available tool that's been packaged up by these loosely affiliated allied regime-allied group of non-state actors to penetrate the machines and the devices of their opponents, gather information, and no doubt engaged in arrest, detention, and probably worse as a result. The activists' effort to spread the word about this kind of malware is quite tricky when the government controls the networks. You have to come up with clever ways to alert your fellows on the internet. And one of the ways that they've been doing that in Syria is that student groups have been taking photographic screenshots of the notes and the warnings that they're trying to spread so that they don't trigger keyword filters or other kinds of surveillance tools that are running on the carrier networks themselves. Here, the Union of Syrian Free Students put up this file, this image. What impresses me, by the way, is like I said before, the sort of brazenness of these groups. Just as a matter of design, I kind of love this web page. This is the Syrian Free Army. They've got a nice little iframe bar down at the bottom that lets you find their Twitter account, Facebook page, read their website in Arabic and English. You can see them here celebrating a hack of Al Jazeera that they did last year. And they keep coming back. So Twitter shut down the Electronic Syrian Army site, or I'm sorry, this was the Twitter site, official SEA, which I believe is still up. Facebook has periodically tried to shut it down. The Electronic Syrian Army page was deleted by Facebook, so then they put up the Army Syrian Electronic page, and the cat and mouse game continues. All right, that's case study number 2, which is in Syria, the operation and existence of these shadowy organizations in between the public and the state itself. So let's take a look then at China, where we've got yet another model in the form of these commercial Weibo sites. So these are microblogging services that a number of the companies over there run. Sina, Tencent, Sohu, Baidu are all in the business of trying to provide communications tools. And some of the most, one of the most popular is Sina's Weibo site, which you can think of as analogous to Twitter. It differs in certain respects, but it's basically the same. And what's quite astonishing about the spread of these sites is that the volume of messages is astounding. The number of people that are on them is impressive. And the ability of these sites to essentially obviate the government's ability to control the news immediately and instantly. So when a bad thing happens from the government's perspective, they can eventually clamp down at half an hour later, an hour later, several hours later, several days later, and try to go back and delete all of the photos and the communications they don't like. But those images and those words are getting out. People learn about things. A high-speed train crash in central China. In this case, it was images of a riot and the police's response to it. The government cannot stop that information from getting out. Now, what I want to talk about in the case of China is puzzled and wondering and speculating that she must have been doping. And so the coach of the U.S. team, a guy named John Leonard, basically said as much, in the press, like, I don't see how you could have this kind of a performance without drugs. And quite a number of Chinese internet users were outraged and angry. And one of the things that you see sometimes in China is this kind of mob effect where people will try to track down somebody in a video doing something they don't like, being rude, in one case, I think harming a cat, got a lot of attention. In this case, people tracked down John Leonard's work and phone, work and home address, phone numbers, mobile phone, fax, email information, and then posted it and spread it all over the place, causing him to endure sort of a flood of angry communications, including threats. And one of the people who spread this around, by the way, was like a very prominent, well-known computer scientist and entrepreneur who had a ton of followers and accelerated it. And so moving one step closer to the government from the broad community of Weibo users is the 50 Cent Party, which is a large group of people essentially paid by the government to do astroturfing and to post propaganda communications out on the internet. All right, so we've seen our Egypt, where the state uses its control of physical infrastructure to shut down communications they don't like. We see in Syria the emergence of these kind of gray zone non-state actors that are allied with the regime but not directly attributable or identifiable. And in the case of China, we see commercially run services and tools that facilitate both good and bad forms of actions that are both real in a constructive sense and threatening as well. By the way, one of the great things about China, I just have to say, is that it's a country with a really fun sense of humor. And one of the things that I like to sort of watch are all of the ways in which the ever cheaper editing and content creation tools that we all love here are equally available over there. And so, for example, when one of these Weibo images of a policeman just, beating up on some students goes viral, you see people creating mashups of Tom Cruise, sticking him into pictures from the Olympics and an Edward Munch photo, a painting, and it gives me, it sort of warms my heart to see people all over the world reacting in the same way to these kinds of moments, which is to say, to make fun of them. Then let's talk about the other broad theme that I want to hit on, which is in addition to the emergence of these kind of novel actors as both friends and opponents in the internet freedom space, also the role of democracies in legislating, regulating, and otherwise taking action that is inimical to internet freedom. We had a great experience in this country with how this issue can unfold in what I think is a constructive way, which was the emergence of a genuinely brain-dead proposal up on Capitol Hill, pumped up by Hollywood and the recording industry, to basically impose technical controls on the internet in order to vindicate what they saw as their right to block at the infrastructure level the sharing of copyrighted files. This was known as SOPA and PIPA. The internet reacted in a last-minute but nevertheless very effective way, highlighting the fact that this bill was moving towards a vote on the floors of the House and the Senate. Google blocked out its homepage. When users clicked through, they got information about the bills, and they got the January 18th. One day later, after an incredible flood of internet reaction, the number of supporters had shrunk and the number of opponents had grown by more than 3 times, and the bill in fact died. So SOPA and PIPA was an example, though, of how in a democracy a justification can be put forward. And sometimes it's protecting children, sometimes it's protecting privacy, sometimes it's advancing the cause of cybersecurity, stopping copyright infringement, all worthy causes, but all of which require technologies and approaches that essentially parallel those that repressive states use in order to engage in political repression. So, to make the obvious point here, internet good, internet bad, right? So the internet can be an important tool for getting people out on the street with low transaction costs for acts of collective action like in Egypt, but the internet can also be used to surveil and subject people to arbitrary arrest and detention in countries that use the same technology in a bad way. So where does that leave us? The most pressing issue at the moment for internet freedom is surveillance. So we generally think, when people talk about this, think about censorship. It's the most visible and dramatic threat to the things that people can do on the internet. But the emerging sort of set of governmental, non-governmental, and quasi-governmental practices that we should all be worried about is surveillance. Of course, in this country, where we have well-funded and elaborate infrastructures of intelligence gathering, we engage in surveillance. We engage in surveillance on the internet, in the telephone systems. We use remote sensing equipment orbiting the planet in satellites. We try to understand what's going on in the world, and we try to find and track down those that are going to try to kill and harm Americans to reach them before they do their evil deeds. Our surveillance infrastructure operates under a rule of law. It's not always perfect. The last administration blessed lawless, warrantless wiretapping, and the telecom companies went along with it, and then Congress immunized it. So it's not like we have a perfect record in this area. Nevertheless, I will say that the intelligence agencies take extremely seriously, in my experience, the rules and restrictions, both constitutional and legislative, that apply to their actions, and we benefit from the fact that we have an apparatus of oversight so that intelligence gathering can take place within a broad framework of rule of law, so that you can take these tools, which are susceptible of good and bad uses, and generally make sure that they're being used for things that we would approve of. But what's interesting in the surveillance space here is that the role of private companies is often overlooked. This is a really great site which I recommend to you. A German member of the European Parliament named Malte Spitz did this great experiment where he used Europe's data protection and data privacy laws, which give him the right to see his own information, to get from Deutsche Telekom, or T-Mobile, all of the information that they had about him and his physical whereabouts over a 2-year period. And then he worked with Die Zeit to create a really great visual graphic where you can actually follow him from the perspective of T-Mobile over the course of 2 years. It's an amazing graphic and quite eye-opening in that it shows you that your mobile phone company knows literally not only where you are, but what your vector of movement is, and indeed often which way you're facing based on which cell tower your phone is talking to. Your phone, of course, is pinging local towers a couple times every minute so that your phone company knows how to send data and phone calls to you. 8 hours a day at that location, travels in between. If we have that kind of data, we know who you are. And it's being gathered in vast databases, troves, and stored all over the world. So the surveillance of governments is one thing to be worried about, maybe less so when there's a rule of law that protects you, but those activities being done by companies are even more concerning. One thing that I do want to say that Assistant Secretary Posner and his team and others in the administration pulled off was turning a spotlight, and a productive one, not a hostile one, on the activities of private companies and the ways in which they can facilitate censorship and surveillance. And so, for example, last April they launched an initiative to crank up sanctions and refine the process of imposing sanctions on those companies and people that are complicit in human rights abuses using information technology in Syria and Iran. It was a good step forward. All right, let me wrap this up. So the broad point here is that we've got a borderless internet and bordered nations, and those bordered nations are trying to figure out how to vindicate their priorities online. The technology makes that very difficult, and so they're naturally very focused on both controlling the technology and using the technology in order to achieve their objectives. We see an amazing array of democratic countries engaged in censorship and surveillance activities that are troubling. And as the leader of the free world, or a leader of the free world, the United States has to grapple with these even as we advance our internet freedom agenda. In Germany, of course, it's illegal to propagate Nazi propaganda, to deny the Holocaust, to advocate for war. In India, which is a vigorous democracy, they have a wide range of censorship policies and practices that prohibit all kinds of speech. In Turkey, which is a democratic country and an important U.S. ally, any insult to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk is still illegal, despite the reforms that their pending potential membership in the European Union have spurred them to take. In Thailand, it is still illegal to insult the king, really to talk about the king in any sort of a negative way. And when a commentator on a web forum posted a comment to that effect, the government went out of its way to indict and prosecute the woman who ran that forum, despite the fact that she hadn't written the comment, and took it down once she found out about it. In South Korea, the government has a whole range of anti-terrorism laws that restrict speech about North Korea. Pakistan has recently implemented a new set of regulations that expands and broadens its ability to block web services like Twitter. In Russia, the security services are increasingly engaged in active surveillance. In Indonesia, blasphemy has been recently added to their IT laws. Iran restricts the internet in all manner of ways. Nigeria has now started to block access to certain websites that they think are inflaming the ethnic unrest up in the north. Even Iraq, now that the United States is fully disengaged, has proposed and recently tabled, encouragingly, but nevertheless has been weighing some kind of censorship or blasphemy law in line with its neighbors. Malaysia is restricting the internet in all kinds of different ways. Mexico's large, massive concentration of connectivity in the hands of Telmex and the various Carlos Slim suite of companies has left it susceptible to accusations that the telecom companies are full of spies for the major drug gangs that use them to engage in the kinds of censorship that we're used to seeing in places like China and Iran in order to identify. Even France has been engaging in prosecutions against people for racist speech, which would be perfectly legal in this country under the First Amendment. And indeed, Australia has been looking at a fully national, technically implemented censorship system that the government keeps trying to get through, pulling back from in the face of public protest, and basically trying to gather its strength to push forward one way or another. And that's a government on the left, by the way. So anyway, all of these are examples of why we should be worried and why we should be troubled and why it's difficult for the United States government to advance internet freedom as a consistent principle. The numbers are quite interesting here. The human population is nearing 7 billion. Total number of internet users around the world is 2.3 billion. Total number of mobile phones in operation now is more than 6 billion. Total number of smartphones is greater than 1 billion right now. And so if you look at the league tables here, this is the top 10 countries by number of internet users. And then you look at the Freedom House rankings of repressive countries, somewhat repressive countries, and then non-repressive countries. Out of the top 10, only the U.S. and the Philippines basically have open and unrestricted internets right now. That, I think, is something we should find quite troubling. If we take a look at the same league table or a similar league table for total mobile phone subscriptions, you look at out of the top 40 countries, how many of them are either very repressive or somewhat repressive, are engaged in extensive controls or moderate levels of control. We see that more than half of the top 40 list are in the yellow or the red category. So this is a very real problem, particularly as the internet is going mobile. So in India, mobile internet traffic now exceeds desktop traffic. And that's a trend that we're just going to see worldwide. Why? Well, because in your pocket right now, if you have a smartphone, you're probably carrying more computing power than the entirety that NASA had available to it to put people on the moon. Moore's law means that these devices are getting more and more powerful every year. Computing storage is getting cheaper. And the cost to run an internet application is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. It's more than 100-to-1 price drop just in the last 12 years to run an application on the internet. Internet traffic continues to boom. The total number of broadband subscribers has gone from 38 million in 2000 to 1.2 billion on mobile devices in 2012, using a somewhat anemic but widespread definition of broadband. So these are the changes that we're looking at. Africa, since 2001, has gone from a single cable that touched on a few countries on its west coast and was very poorly terminated by the telecom companies that controlled it, to today having a whole host of competing cables up and down both coasts, to by the end of 2012 last year having a very impressive amount of submarine fiber, which is increasingly distributed through fiber connections in their countries. To quote William Gibson, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. And that future that we're heading towards is one where everybody on the planet, more or less, is going to have a broadband-enabled smartphone capable of not only enormous amounts of download, but also upload and content creation as well. So why does this matter? Well, it's because the internet has a kind of an architectural ideology baked into it. The internet is a network of point-to-point connections, rather than single transmitters of radio, TV, or publishing a signal where the consumer sits and passively supported the president in the 2008 campaign. I worked on his technology team, and we pioneered the use of a lot of online tools to try to get people organized around President Obama's campaign. When we got into the White House, however, we discovered that the reality of government was really quite different from what we had experienced on the campaign, and there were a tremendous number of frustrations and headaches in those first 2 years. One of the first big frustrations that I encountered, or one of the ones that really stuck in my memory, was that in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake in early 2010, we encountered the ways in which a government can basically sort of handicap its ability to respond to a crisis. So when the earthquake happened, it was in the middle of the night. When I woke up the next morning, I got onto my computer, as I usually do. I had Skype opened, and as I was reading the news, I also noticed that two people that I'd gotten to know in a prior professional context, that were the technical directors of ISPs in Haiti, were online and on Skype. And so I checked in with them and how they were doing, and the situation was terrible. The earthquake had just happened. They were trying to figure out what's going on, and they were physically located at the top of Boudier Hill, which is a hill that overlooks Port-au-Prince, and was where the co-location facility for the various mobile phone companies and the ISPs had their facilities. It was a high point, and so connectivity could come in wirelessly through a point-to-point microwave connection that came in through the Dominican Republic, and also they had a fiber cable going up through the port down below, and then they could use this hill to project their wireless connections down to their customers down below. Anyway, they were up there tending to the machines, which in the absence of electricity were running on generators, and they were trying to figure out how to get their families out, and they were trying to figure out if their staff was still alive, and you know, family and members and neighbors and so forth. But they were also trying to keep these networks running. Anyway, so I was able to chat with them on Skype, and they gave me sort of a download of what was going on, and I quickly raced into the White House. And when I got to my desk, I realized, like, oh, I can't get Skype. Like, Skype is blocked on the White House system. And so what I had to do was go back to my house, get my laptop, and then violate all of the IT rules in the White House, which was have a laptop with a Verizon Air card sitting next to my desktop. And I would Skype with these guys who I just randomly happened to know, but who had no other point of contact with the U.S. government. And then I would relay communications to Southcom, by email. And eventually they could, of course, do the same. The Southcom people could do the same thing directly. But it was a moment when I realized, the government's allergies and concerns about cybersecurity were preventing it from using the tool that you would want to use in a disaster to keep in touch with the people you want to keep in touch with. Skype is way better than anything the U.S. government had available to it to know what was going on the ground in Haiti, and it was disallowed. So there is a good part to the story, of course, which is that in this administration we've seen the White House study a really cool and innovative petitioning site in Latvia called monoballs.lv, and realized that it had some really cool lessons to teach about how the U.S. government might make a petition site non-sucky, which is not easy, and thus was born We the People. So governments can actually look and learn. They can embrace tools that are not obviously available despite that. So, in conclusion, I want to just say a few nice things about the State Department's point, but it didn't really amount to much. The team that has been working for Secretary Clinton has focused very hard, elevated the profile of the issue. She's given 2 major addresses about it, and then followed through with actual actions. These are diplomatic actions, policy actions, in some cases rulemaking actions like at the FCC. But the effect has been very real, and I think it's very welcome. At the same time, we've seen the emergence of trade in information as a kind of organizing principle for U.S. government action, and this is one that I feel is quite promising. I first sat down with the Bush administration's Trade Reps Office in 2007 and made a pitch for why they should start to think about censorship as a trade barrier. The idea being that, the United States makes tons of money as a country off of information. Broadly construed, that includes movies and books, newspapers, magazines, as well as internet services, and that censorship was the top trade barrier that we face as an industry. And since 2007, that team took it seriously, but it has become a much more direct part of the U.S. government's trade agenda. This Facebook map, I think, is very telling. If you look and try to see these are expressions of the connections among people on Facebook. And if you look at China, you can see that China is essentially missing. Very few Facebook users in China. Why? Because Facebook is blocked in China at the infrastructure level. At the same time that the United States sits here and watches Facebook get blocked in China, we allow RenRen, which is a Chinese competitor, to come to our capital markets, raise $780 million in an IPO from investors that we're facilitating here. So we give them access to our markets, they block us from their markets. That seems like a classic trade barrier, and one that the United States should take seriously. One path, of course, is the state-to-state path, which is to bring a complaint in the WTO, and I think it's great that the U.S. government has been looking seriously at that. There's a very good argument under the GATS for why the commitments that China has made are being violated by blocking that service, and the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, I think, deserves praise for having pushed that issue forward, at least as a discussion matter. So, wrapping it all up then, the Internet is democratizing and decentralizing access to communications and information. Information is power. The Internet is democratizing and decentralizing power. We all know that. These are now truisms. The democratization also brings disruption. In data, news, culture, politics, entertainment, and business, passive consumption is becoming active creation. As a result, governments, both democratic governments and despotic governments, are fighting to maintain and extend control via censorship, via surveillance, via propaganda and astroturfing, and by tactical alliances with new and emergent groups of non-state actors that can do things that are essentially untraceable and yet advance the agenda of the government. What we need then to venture a kind of a possibly very lame sort of buzzwordy approach to this is Internet Freedom 2.0. In other words, an Internet freedom agenda which is not simply looking at the most obvious high-level examples of censorship and surveillance by state actors, but more broadly is looking at information restrictions imposed by companies in democratic countries, information restrictions and limits on Internet freedom that are being advanced legislatively or otherwise in democratic countries. And we need to be looking at the intersection between efforts to keep the Internet secure and infrastructure implemented restrictions that can be used for ill. The battlefields this year are going to be things like in censorship and content control, surveillance by governments with rule of law, and in particular by companies who are in a position to see what their users are doing, store it, and then put it to work for good or for ill. The cybersecurity debate that's unfolding in Washington right now is very interesting. The White House has done something which personally I'm quite happy with, which is issue an executive order that says the U.S. government's role here should be to contribute more to conversations using the information that it uniquely gathers in order to help equipment manufacturers, software makers, and others use the information to protect people. But what we keep seeing on Capitol Hill is an effort to create rigid and hardened cybersecurity standards as though security was some kind of a checklist that you could achieve compliance with and then be done with it. That's a terrible approach, and one that I hope the administration and Congress will reject. And finally, in the open internet area, we've got political issues in democracies like network neutrality, wireless network neutrality, competition or the lack thereof among facilities and infrastructure providers, and legislative acts like SOPA, PIPA, ACTA, and the Cybersecurity Act, CISPA, that potentially could undermine globally the free flows of information that we're trying to protect. Thank you very much. If I have time. So I guess this is the Q&A phase. Before Sarah hobbles up to the mic here, I'll just say that. Anybody want to angrily condemn anything I've said? Shout it out. Oh, hi.
You know, my position is really clear: to protect intellectual property and copyright. And I heard the last part. I didn't hear you come out in terms of people that own copyrights and IP and don't want it distributed freely, and we do want to profit from what we create. Would you address that?
You've asked me this question at an event before, and I think I stumbled over the answer to it because I don't understand your question. But so let me just say, if you're asking, should people who own copyrights be able to prevent unauthorized use of them? Sure, you bet. We've got legal mechanisms for that. They're called lawsuits, and that's how you protect your copyrights, your trademarks, your patents. We have legal mechanisms that are well developed and able to do that. What you don't do is implement censorship technologies in order to broadly block flows of information on the theory that they might potentially be used to infringe copyrights. Anybody else? Yeah, over there.
Hey, Andrew. I have a question. I'm really glad you brought the cybersecurity issue into this debate, because I think it's a real part of the broader internet freedom ecosystem questions. But my question is this. With cybersecurity, you know, you didn't mention the Mandiant report, or you talked a lot about blocking by the Chinese, but this economic espionage and economic, I mean, I don't want to use the word warfare, but people have used it. I mean, how is that changing the landscape as well?
So what seems to be happening is that countries are focusing their cybersecurity energies in two ways. One is offense and the other is defense. And when I say countries, I really mean like a handful of the most sophisticated, wealthiest countries in the world, or the ones with the most resources anyway. Offense means that you're going out and trying to U.S. Corporations' machines, for example, and I think U.S. companies are getting more comfortable reporting that information, so we're more aware of it. But look, it is absolutely the case that networked computer systems that are running executable files, or operating systems that can run executable files, have forever been vulnerable to malware of various descriptions. So this is not just a Windows thing, it's an OS thing, it's a Linux thing. If you're running an operating system that can run other people's code and it's connected to the network, there's a good chance that there's an exploit somewhere to be found on it. And so various countries have teams of people that try to figure out how to take advantage of that, get the information that they want. One interesting wrinkle is that, at least if you read the New York Times anyway, increasing numbers of U.S. companies are confronting what seems to be strategic or tactical exfiltration of information for business advantage. And that is absolutely true. Governments have been aware of this, I think, for quite a while, and are trying to figure out how to lock down their systems and configure their networks and basically secure themselves quite a bit better without cutting themselves off from the internet entirely. So what I think is interesting is the question is, like, what's the response? So you've got a private sector that is increasingly conscious of its vulnerability and trying to figure out how to prevent it. Others with increasingly capable offensive capabilities that are trying to get in. What's the role of government, between those two? And I think from where I come from, the wrong approach is to try to say we are going to require or mandate the following steps in order for our companies to be secure. Even with regard to government agencies, that makes me nervous, because what you see is the emergence of kind of like checklist security, where once a year you verify that you've done the following things, or once a quarter, and then everyone acts as though you're secure. Internet security is a constant and unfolding web of conversations. That's the way to think about it. Cisco has to talk to the people that it's sold its equipment to, and the people that are running its operating systems at the router level. Symantec or Microsoft needs to talk to everybody that's got a Windows browser. They need to talk to academics that are finding exploits. They need to talk to government agencies that are finding exploits, identifying. It's a non-stop series of conversations where you're learning, adjusting your software, adjusting your practices. And the role of government, I think, should be to facilitate those conversations so that people with the natural self-interest and incentive to protect their own networks are in a position to do so effectively. That's sort of my take on it. Yep.
I'm far away from the mic, so I'll just shout it out. I really appreciated what you said about framing this issue as internet censorship as a trade barrier. And I think it's valuable to remember that, I often hear people when we discuss who's impacted by internet censorship, people tend to think by default about dissidents, people who are going online and saying things that states may not appreciate, who are subject to surveillance and may be punished for that. But I think an important dimension, and this may be another way of pursuing remedies, is it has tremendous impacts on human health, on environment. And an example that I often go back to is in 2003, the SARS outbreak, which was vigorously censored and had also transnational implications, as many people in Canada and elsewhere were infected and some died. And so I'm curious, and the same could be said of environment, that governments often censor news when there are, when factories pump toxins into rivers, for instance, and imperil the health of sometimes millions of people. So I'd be curious if you think that there are...
One of the most interesting 6 months really has been, you can watch the Chinese censorship apparatus looking at the pollution in Beijing, right? And all the communications about it, including tweets from the U.S. Embassy there, by the way, which runs a monitor and publishes the results of that particle monitor. You can see their infrastructure going like, what do we do? Like they can't quite figure out how to use their usual approach, which is to clamp down and block all communication, because, pollution in Beijing affects 20 million people, let's say, and people are communicating about it so much. It's the classic kind of issue that the government would have tried to just shut down discussion of in 10 years ago, let's say, or 20 years ago, and now they just can't. And to me, watching to see what actually interesting. But anyway, your broader point, though, is can you shift this debate in a useful way onto a commercial footing and a trade footing in a way that depoliticizes the arguments and turns them into economic arguments where you may be on stronger footing, we may be on stronger footing where the government may be more comfortable making compromises. So the question to me is like how, right? And so there's like there's a good argument for doing that. It's in our economic interest and it advances the goal. There's a broad, approach, which is to bring complaints against countries that are doing it under their existing obligations under GATS or the other instruments that underlie the WTO. The other approach, which I think should be happening in parallel, is that in every single bilateral agreement that we're striking around trade, we, especially with our friendliest partners with the most like-minded approaches to free speech and censorship, is to be inserting into those agreements strong language that commits both parties to the free flows of information, just like we have done in past decades for the auto industry or for electronics or other kinds of products that are important to the U.S. economy. So the point of that is that as we strike a bilateral agreement with, let's say, Australia, a bilateral agreement with, let's say, the Europeans in the next 4 years, if the administration pulls that off, you get language in it that establishes that the international trade system is capable of identifying and protecting free flows of information. The issue has always been that trade agreements nearly always, I shouldn't say nearly always contain carve-outs for things like public health, safety, often public morals, and that is a potentially very capacious set of exceptions that governments can invoke, even under the best kind of free flows of information trade language, in order to restrict information for their own purposes. Nevertheless, I do think it's quite useful because one of the things that you can always point to is the existence of disparate treatment. And in the case of China, that's what underlies either a WTO complaint or any other kind of complaint that the U.S. government might make, is that even if they are engaged in activities that they believe are justified to protect public morals or health and welfare and so forth, they're treating U.S. companies differently. And that is the thing that I think is kind of the immediate thin entering wedge that lets this become a trade issue, is pointing out that they are not treating Ren and Facebook the same. Yeah, go for it.
I wanted to drill in on the private company data. If data is the new oil and there's this data rush happening, you've been in both technology and in government. You know that government is so far behind what private companies are doing. What is the pathway for that? Are the companies going to get further ahead than our government's ability to understand what they're doing before they're roped back? Or is there data philanthropy model that's going to come out?
So I have to say, I think about this as basically like kind of a step function, not an ever accelerating slope. In other words, what companies have figured out how to do is kind of gather information about your activities. Geodata, for example, if you're a telecom company, or the contents of communications and things that you're either consuming or writing. But that's kind of it. There isn't, I don't feel like, I feel like companies, the private sector kind of jumped ahead of what government and its policymakers were able to. Surprise, I think the administration has been taking the right approach, which is basically to say we ought to have some baseline privacy legislation that sets some basic expectations across industries. Because right now what the U.S. has is this kind of patchwork of sort of default unfair and deceptive trade practice jurisdiction for the FTC, plus specific statutes for finance, healthcare, videotape rentals, and a couple of other things that have provoked specific legislation. But other than the baseline Federal Trade Act, there just isn't anything that addresses the information world. I should say telecom companies have a set of regulations under the FCC too for what they can do. But the administration says, so let's just have a baseline law that sets basic functional expectations for what companies can and can't do and the kinds of consent and transparency that they have to engage in. Not going all the way towards where the Europeans are, which is to have these highly overly, in my view, overly specified but universally applicable conditions that are then implemented in very bureaucratic and formalistic regulatory structures, but instead have a functional approach that looks at the basic requirements for citizen control, transparency, and so forth. So I'm not worried about a kind of infinite slope upward where industry just constantly beats the government, because the universe is pretty well known at this point. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, great presentation, and thanks very much. My question is pretty much a follow-on to this gentleman's. Yeah, the technology advances more quickly, and our ability to cope with it maybe not quite so much. You've articulated that you're pleased with the, I'm going to say, the regulatory environment in the United States. I'm thinking, however, you pointed out a very real tension between using an open environment for good or for ill. And the reason we've even got laws at all is because you can't trust everybody to do the right thing all the time. In the absence of what you consider a favorable regulatory environment, someplace else. What actually are going to be the actual checks and balances on the kind of conduct that nobody in this room is real anxious to see, but the danger of which you've pointed out rather clearly? I'm asking, what do you see as regulating this?
So that's a great question. So, I mean, so that goes to this the basic, structural point here, which is that the network itself is borderless. The services that you might be accessing could be located in any country. Yet national jurisdiction, the laws that protect us, are bounded by, lines on a map. So the answer is there isn't going to be any easy or magical solution to this, right? There is no global regulatory body that's going to come along and protect privacy. It's just not going to happen. So 2 points about that. One is it really raises the stakes for what choices companies make. And look, we're going to be hearing from Rebecca McKinnon. This is like my old law school days coming back to haunt me. Rebecca McKinnon has written extensively and incredibly insightfully about the menu of choices that companies face when they look at tapping global markets. So if Google is going to set up a server, a data center in, let's say, Thailand, then Google is suddenly going to have to be subject to Thai jurisdiction for anything that data center might hold or touch. Figure out how you could be turning over data about only the people in China when their friends might be in this country or in Germany, France, or elsewhere. It's very hard to figure out how you could comply with surveillance and limit its scope and effect to just users physically in China. Very hard to do with a social graph. So where I think we're going to end up is we're going to have to make judgments about which things we do on the internet, which services we use based on the usual signals of reputation. There will be companies that will merit your trust and companies that will not merit your trust. And I think one of the things that we don't see right now is very much visibility on the part of users into what the services that they're using online, what countries they're subject to. I bet I don't know, as a former Google employee, I bet I don't know all the places that Google has data centers today, right? And that's important because each one of those data centers potentially holds my information and has a government attached to it that can exercise jurisdiction over its contents. So anyway, I don't have a great satisfying answer to that question, but I do think that it's an area for more work so that users understand what they're getting into when they turn their data over. And this is, by the way, nanny-ish point to all of you. Don't just go sign up for things that are getting access to your email account because it's a cool thing that you saw blogged on TechCrunch. Don't do it. You don't know what's happening after you've given people access to your Facebook accounts, your Google accounts, your LinkedIn accounts, and so forth. They run Twitter. They run these great APIs that allow you to auth into other people's services, and it may help you manage your inbox, for example, but don't do it unless you really know who the company is, where they're storing your data, what they're keeping, and so forth. And they very often don't give you great information up front about how that works.
Hi, thank you. What role do you see open source software playing in this debate in lowering transaction costs, in like improving people's security on their operating system, stuff like that? Thank you.
So open source software is one of the great achievements of modern mankind. It really is. And the internet is fundamental to the success of open source software. So oftentimes when people hear open source, they think communism, right? They think open source is like, weird nerds that just do stuff for free because, just for fun or whatever. Open source software is software that groups of people develop collaboratively in order to solve their problems. They're trying to build software that they want to use. So companies engage in the development of open source software. They will sometimes open source things with a hope or the expectation that it'll keep getting better when the developer community is broadened to include anybody who's interested in using it. I keep saying, sort of making this point, which is open source is in some ways like pure Ayn Randian libertarian self-interest at work in a collective way, right? And so I think it's an amazing achievement, and it's facilitated by the existence of the internet, where people can find projects, look at the source code, contribute to it, figure out where the bugs are, fix them for their own purposes, add modules, and so forth. And so there was a moment when we kind of wondered in the early 2000s, like, would open source just be like kind of a brief blip, and then commercial companies would come in and just dominate it? But we've seen a significant growth in the range of code bases and code packages that are open source, the extent to which people are working together on these kinds of projects. It's great. I think it's awesome. And I think it is one of the constellation of ways in which we're going to end up with more secure story. Proprietary software exists for a good reason. Many people find that it's better or more valuable, it updates faster, it has better user interfaces, all kinds of reasons why proprietary software might be better. But for many of the most critical systems that our networks run, open source is the best choice because it has to face the steepest test of security, which is the complete openness of its code to anybody who wants to look at it. All right, with that, let's move on. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. I have to say, Andrew and I were emailing yesterday, and he said, "What do you think I should talk about?" And so clearly, I don't know where that came from, but it was terrific, and just a really good overview of a lot of what we're going to cover in the rest of the day, both in the panels coming up after the break and in the breakout sessions. So thank you again. We're about to take a break until about 10:45. But while that's happening, I understand that there's going to be a Twitter poll. And there is. Okay. So the question is, how would you best describe yourself? And the options are tech, civil, gov, and biz. So I think you should just tweet your response to the hashtag #TechAtState, and we'll have results streaming in throughout the break and results when we come back. One final note before we break, or two notes. One, if you're standing along the back, feel free to come and sit down after the break. There's plenty of seats, so no need to stand along the back. And then secondly, just Andrew in his presentation showed a photo of former Secretary Clinton speaking her second Internet Freedom speech in 2011, and it's worth noting that she was standing right there. So just a note of the special relationship GW to Internet Freedom to the State Department. And so thanks again. We'll look forward to hearing from Dawn Nunziato, who's a professor here, when she chairs the plenary